So I've been sharing through Teresa's writing on the interior castle, looking at, she describes these different mansions that as we grow spiritually, as we advance in knowing God, she describes these different, she calls them mansions that we enter as we get closer and closer to God. So to picture it, picture a bunch of concentric circles, and each of these circles, as you get closer in, is a new mansion. So over the last few months, we've talked about this first phase, which is where we meet Christ, where we have this tangible experience of God's grace, and we come to God largely out of this need for what God can give us. And then as we grow, we reach this point of frustrations and temptations where Teresa says, hey, pay attention. These things that are bothering you, they wouldn't have bothered you before. The stuff that you're going through is actually a sign that you are growing. And then she says, as we continue, we reach this phase of discipleship where more and more we want to live like Jesus. We want to emulate how Jesus lived. We want to please God more with our actions. And then last time I shared about this fourth phase, and it's this movement from this really active spirituality that's all about what do I do to grow in relationship to God, and it begins to shift into a more receptive spirituality where it's not just about growth with God over what I do, but it's about learning to be patient and receive and wait on God. It's this beginning of seeing God as something bigger than just this vending machine in the sky that gives us things if we're just good enough, and instead begins to see God as this lover of humanity, as this lover of us individually. So today we're going to talk about the fifth mansion. And the fifth mansion is a continuation of this beginning to see God for who God is, and to love God not just for what God gives us, but for perceiving God as God is. And so Teresa says, as we enter this phase, we begin to see this wholeness, this otherness of God that's so vastly different from who we are, that God is so freely able to love and be loved in ways that we struggle with. And as we begin to see this, we often become frustrated, because as we perceive this God, we realize we have these things within us that blocks us from being able to do this. And Teresa says, yes, that's the sign that you are continuing to grow. You're perceiving God for who God is, and it's natural that you're frustrated that you have this distance from God because you're grasping God's otherness. And so she says, as we enter this phase, if we begin to be still in our time with God and just enjoy our presence with God, God begins to transform us, not in things that we can control. We continue to do the stuff of like acting strongly to do what's right, but there's this growth that happens just from being in the presence of God that's beyond what we can control. So she alludes to Mary and Martha, and she says, in this phase, this is where our Mary and our Martha begin to work together. So what she's saying with this is, she's alluding to the stories in the gospel where Mary and Martha are at this meal with the disciples, and Mary is sitting learning from Jesus, and Martha is busy doing all of this stuff, and Martha gets mad because Mary isn't helping, and Jesus says, no, Martha, it's okay, you can be here too. And so for some of us, we're more wired to be in this active role of doing and being active, wanting to see things done. And for some of us, it's more about just being and being present. And so Teresa is saying, you need both of these. You need your Mary and your Martha to work together. The fulfillment of this is very much in line with John 17, it's called Jesus' High Priestly Prayer. And so as we continue in worship this morning, I'm going to read a few verses from the end of John chapter 17. This is going to start with verse 22. I have given them the glory you gave me, so they may be one as we are one. I am in them, and you are in me. May they experience such perfect unity that the world will know that you sent me and that you love them as much as you love me. Father, I want these whom you have given me to be with me where I am. Then they can see all the glory you gave me because you loved me even before the world began. O righteous Father, the world doesn't know you, but I do, and these disciples know you sent me. I revealed you to them, and I will continue to do so. Then your love for me will be in them, and I will be in them.
Would you stand as we sing our first song today?
Good morning, everybody. Morning. Before we get started here, let me send our older kids off to their time of learning and discussion. My name is Dustin. If I don't know you yet, I'm one of the pastors and elders here. If you haven't been around lately, or maybe this is your first Sunday with us, we've been doing a series on some different beliefs, some common beliefs that people have when it comes to the church community. Church myths, if you will. Last week we talked about church is about me, in the beginning we talked about church is about me and what I get out of it. We've talked about the belief I can be a Christian without the church. And we talked about I don't get anything out of church last week. We've had some great discussions that have been sparked on Sundays that kind of have been spilling out to the rest of the week, which is always encouraging. Today we talk about another common belief as it regards the church community, and that is, if the church lets me down, I have to find a new one. If the church lets me down, I have to find a new one. And I want to begin today with a question to get us started. What do you think, in your opinion, what are some legitimate reasons to leave a church community? What do you think? What would cause you to say, that's it, I'm out, I'm finding a new place?
Snake handling.
Snake handling. I'll make a note of that. No snake handling. Shouldn't have to worry about that.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, only men can speak in front of the church. Abuse of power. Without repentance or accountability. Yes. I've seen a number of those stories.
Downplaying the significance of Jesus.
What's that?
Exclusivity to other races.
Yeah, exclusivity to other races or other kinds of people. What were we saying?
I was just saying, downplaying the significance of Jesus.
Downplaying the significance of Jesus.
No vision of the Great Commission.
Okay.
No desire to carry out the Great Commission.
Okay, no vision of the Great Commission or desire to carry that out.
Dogmatic.
Okay, yeah, churches are very dogmatic. Bob, you look like you're dying to say something.
Well, I was going to say bad copy, but I'm pretty sure that's not one. But alongside dogmatic, the ditch on the other side of the road is, and I think somebody said this about Jesus, but there's a certain core set of things that make up what Christianity is. And when we begin to trade those things away, we cease to be what we're meant to be. So there's dogmatic on one side about a lot of things that don't matter, and then there's being non-dogmatic on the things that do matter. So non-dogmatic on that road.
Right, yeah. No, I get what you're saying, though. That makes sense. Yeah, so, surely there's some legitimate reasons to leave a church community or feel like you need to find a new one. There's no question about that. And I had some listed down that people have already talked about, so I don't feel the need to repeat what you guys have already said. Let me go the other way and ask this. This should be interesting, actually. What do you think are some bad reasons to leave a church community?
Don't like the music.
So snarky. Don't like the music, okay.
Too many Cubs fans?
Oh, too many Cubs fans. There's only one here, right? Is that too many? That's right. Ben Dudley's jumping on the bandwagon. And Sarah over there, yeah. Go Cubs! Cubs! That's funny. I'm glad to see you here today, Joel. Does this mean our cool down period's over? Okay, good. He's a Pirates fan. Yeah.
I think probably one of the big ones that really I think a lot of people do this is if, and this goes into that whole dogmatic, non-dogmatic, where's the right balance, but if a pastor or somebody teaches something that I just don't agree with on something that's really not one of those core issues.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because somebody hurt your feelings.
Yeah, because somebody hurt your feelings.
Or I think it's along the same line. Stuff came up in the context of ministry, and rather than dealing with it and working through it, it's just
Yeah, it's kind of an escape from some of the more difficult parts relationally and in ministry of the church. Yeah.
I think if it doesn't meet your social needs.
If it doesn't meet your social needs.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, I don't know about you. As I was thinking about this week, I had a harder time coming up with bad reasons to leave the church. I feel like it's really easy to jump on here's all the good reasons or reasons why you should find a new church. But I had a more difficult time with the bad reasons, and I think maybe that's common. And part of that is because it's hard to make judgments on reasons to leave a church, partially because our consumer mindset tends to tell us that there are no bad reasons to leave a church community. It's whatever you prefer. We should go wherever we prefer, where we like worship, where we like the preaching, where we like the people. It's kind of all about our consumer preference. And then when we no longer prefer this one over another, then we switch to the one that now we prefer, that we like, that we enjoy. So the fact that there could actually be bad reasons to leave a church is hard to understand. It's hard to make those judgments. We tend to switch churches like we switch toothpaste or laundry detergent. We tend to like the new and improved versions. I mean, I've seen that, being in Portland for 9 years, I've seen that all the time. Of people that are really excited about one place, but then this new, really cool hipster church starts, and it's like, oh, we're going to all go there now. I just see it over and over again. It's so easy for us to do that. And so you take that consumer preference, and then you add in the possibility, more like the probability, that there's going to be hurt and disappointment and conflict involved in the church. Like, how easy is it to run out the doors when that happens? And so, pretty soon you can kind of find yourself in this pattern of finding a new church community every 2 or 3 years. And maybe the question that we need to be asking is, are we missing out on something when we jump ship anytime the waters get rough? Or that our consumer preferences aren't satisfied? Is there something we're missing by doing that? Bonhoeffer, it's so weird. That church is weird. Bonhoeffer, in his fantastic book, Life Together.
Oh, wait a minute.
Have I talked about Life Together recently? Okay, yeah, thanks, Rob. Actually thinks that disappointment and disillusionment with our idealism of the church community is a necessary and healthy development in our maturity and growth. And he says that the quicker we are disillusioned by the wish dreams that we bring into the church community, the better for everyone. The quicker you come here and are disillusioned with how crappy we can be, the better. Including ourselves. But many people never allow that to happen. Because of the first hint of disappointment, the first hint of disillusionment of, oh, this isn't what I thought it was, you leave. And avoid that altogether. Now, I've got to be honest with you, the past couple of weeks, I've been looking for all of the passages in the New Testament about reasons to leave a church community. And believe it or not, I couldn't find any dealing specifically with that. Paul never wrote to anyone, "Dear Barnabas, if you're having a hard time at the church, maybe it's time to start looking for another one." Or "Dear Titus, has the music improved at all?" I mean, have you checked out that other thing? I hear they have some like former band musicians from somewhere. Have you checked that out? And surely part of that is that they didn't have a whole lot of options in New Testament times, right? If you lived in Ephesus in the first century, you went to the church that met in Ephesus. If you lived in Philippi, well, it's an easy decision. You go to the church that met there. You didn't like the music or the way people sang communally? Like, too bad. Tough luck. And if at some point something didn't go your way, guess what? There were no other options. So again, tough luck. Logistically, you were forced to deal with your disappointment and hurt in the community. Which, as we'll see in a minute, has some results that really we may not want to miss out on. And you know, it kind of is another preface before we actually get to our passage. Let's not fall into the silliness of thinking that the New Testament church is some idyllic period of time when everything was awesome. There's actually a church in our neighborhood, kind of down near the Woodstock neighborhood, called, I've seen their sign outside, called New Testament Church. You know, it's a thing they don proudly, like, we're getting back to the way things were in the New Testament. We're awesome. And I always wonder, like, I've run by there a number of times, and I always wonder, well, are you the New Testament church where a guy was sleeping with his stepmother? Or are you more like the New Testament church where there were individuals sleeping with prostitutes at pagan temples? Like, what kind of New Testament church would you guys say you are? And it's weird because you read through the New Testament, the leaders were just as messed up as anybody else. We kind of idolize some of these people, and you know, and for good reason for some of them, but Peter was a total hypocrite. I mean, this was a guy that would eat with Gentile believers when none of his Jewish buddies were around, but then all of a sudden, when his Jewish friends were around, he wouldn't be seen with them. Like, yeah, that's cool, Peter. And Barnabas just followed along. He's kind of a pushover. He's like, well, I'm just going to do what Peter does. I'm not going to ask any questions. Or you know, there was the women who were leaders in the church in Philippi who were dividing the church because of some personal argument. Or you've got, in Philippians as well, Paul's helpers seem to be really motivated only out of self-interest. Reading, you know, this week as I was reading about all of the problems in the New Testament, it actually made me feel pretty good about our church. I want to call non-New Testament church, just so people know we're not super screwed up. The truth is, though, people have always screwed up in the church. People have always done dumb stuff. People have always hurt one another, said insensitive things, neglected to care for someone who needed it. But the only difference in the New Testament times is they didn't have 1,000 other options in town for them to check out. There's no such thing as church shopping yet. They had to figure out how to work through it. And Paul seems to think that in the process of that, something key actually happens. If you have a Bible, you can flip open to Ephesians chapter 4. So far in this letter, Paul has explained how we were dead to sin, or dead in our sin. But God is so rich in mercy, loved us so much that he gave us life when he raised Christ from the dead. And then he goes on to tell us in chapter 3 about this mysterious plan that God has revealed in Jesus of incorporating Jews and Gentiles together into one body and reconciling these two peoples. And at the end of these 3 chapters, Paul stops to give thanks to God. He's so overwhelmed by the thoughts of all that God has done that he ends with glory to him in the church. and in Christ Jesus through all generations forever and ever. And then at the beginning of chapter 4, he gets to some very practical instructions for the local church community. He says this, verse 1 to 6. Therefore, I, a prisoner for serving the Lord, beg you to lead a life worthy of your calling. For you have been called by God. Always be humble and gentle. Be patient with each other, making allowance for each other's faults because of your love. Make every effort to keep yourselves united in the Spirit, binding yourselves together with peace. For there is one body and one Spirit, just as you have been called to one glorious hope for the future. There is one Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God and Father of all, who is over all, in all, and living through all. I want you to notice something in this passage that we just read. All of these things that Paul is encouraging here are only practices that you would need when things aren't going particularly well. When there are hurts or annoyances, differences, offenses, conflicts. If there were no problems, we would never need to make allowance for each other. If there were no problems, we would never have to make an effort, to make every effort to stay united as a church. We wouldn't need to be patient, and on, all of these things. They would be irrelevant. And Paul reminds this local church community of sinful people what God has done so that they can teach them what the gospel means and how they respond to one another in community. When there are hurts, slights, disappointments, unmet expectations. This section is all about our responses to those things, which assumes that we're going to have problems with one another. And I think it's fair to say if your expectation is that church community is always going to be smooth sailing, well, you may want to change your expectations a little bit. But most of you probably know that by now. But it helps if you expect it and are ready to respond to these challenges in Christian love. Paul brings up humility, gentleness, patience, making allowance for each other's faults, making every effort to keep yourself united, binding ourselves together in peace. I kept thinking like it may be most beneficial for us just to read these 6 verses over and over again for the next 30 minutes until we all have that memorized. And then when we do come up against some disappointment or some frustration or annoyances, we can just have that in the back of our minds. And we're like, oh, Paul taught us how to respond to those things. It's humility and gentleness and patience and bearing with one another. Because realistically, how many conflicts do you think couldn't be resolved or hurts healed in the church community if there were 2 parties who were committed to these things because of what God has done in Jesus? I mean, are there any? How many times would someone have to leave the church and find a new one after a hurt if everyone was making every effort, being patient, being humble, being gentle? I would imagine not too many. And as I look back at some of the conflict over my last 9 years of being part of this community, I can attest that out of the ones that ended badly, or where a relationship was severed, these things were clearly missing on one side, if not both sides. There was no humility, there was no gentleness, there was no patience, there was no effort. But those kinds of things take a level of maturity, right? I mean, you can't just do what Paul tells you to do here by your own natural effort. It takes some kind of growth, some kind of maturity, and it makes you wonder, well, how does someone attain the maturity where they can respond to hurts as described by Paul in Ephesians 4? How does that happen? Bob used that running metaphor last week about how You don't just go out for a run on Saturday morning and get done and say, yeah, I guess I'm good. Like I'm set. It accomplished what I set out to attain. Like I'm good. I'm in shape. I guess I don't have to run anymore. That'd be silly. You know, those of you who are runners or do other things that are cool, to get in shape or to become a good runner takes a long time of consistently running. And a lot of it's terrible. But it's the only way. And to take that metaphor a bit further, I would contend that it's the more difficult runs where you see your greatest gains, right? It's the more difficult runs where you see your greatest gains as a runner. When your legs feel like lead, when you don't have any energy, when you're doing a big hill, but you press on and you complete what you set out to do. You see huge gains there. In other words, the biggest challenges present you the greatest opportunities for growth. The biggest challenges present you the greatest opportunities for growth, and I wonder if it's not the same with relationships. I wonder if it's not the same in church community. I think it is. I think it's the difficult times, the conflicts, the misunderstandings where you have the opportunity to make your greatest gains in character formation. But for that to happen, you know, the first step is to stay. To stay and learn how to work through these things with humility and grace and forgiveness. All the things that Paul invites us into. And we're going to make mistakes in doing that. You know, I was thinking this week, in the last 9 years of Evergreen, if I would have left every time it got hard, every time there was a painful conflict, I can clearly see now that I would have totally short-circuited everything that God desired to accomplish in me through those times. Today, if I would have kept leaving every time, I would still be my immature 26-year-old self. Learning how to work through conflict and hurt, I feel like it's a pretty steep learning curve. And I would have loved to avoid it the way that I love avoiding any kind of hills while running. And I still would sometimes, but I can see so clearly how much I would have missed out on in terms of character formation, in terms of growth and maturity. And that's why I remain in community even when it gets tough, even when it sucks. And so while the New Testament doesn't have any passages on when to leave the church and find a new one, it does tell us how to relate to one another even when we disagree, even when there's been a big disappointment. And Paul goes on a little later in the chapter, because he doesn't just speak about how you can respond to others who are being crappy to you in the church. After he speaks of giving the church gifts to equip every part of the body so it grows up into Christ, he also tells us how we can contribute to other people not wanting to bail. And he says this later on in verse 31. He says, "Get rid of all bitterness and rage and anger and harsh words and slander, as well as all types of evil behavior. Instead, be kind to each other, tender-hearted, forgiving one another, just as God, through Christ, has forgiven you. Imitate God, therefore, in everything you do, because you are His dear children. Live a life filled with love, following the example of Christ. He loved us and offered Himself as a sacrifice for us, a pleasing aroma to God." You know, I think what can make a tremendous difference in your attitude toward the church is one, I mean, just simply accepting the fact that we're all imperfect, right? I mean, that's kind of a no-brainer. It might even be good to ask yourself, what am I expecting from these other imperfect, sinful people? What am I expecting? And that's not to excuse anything. But I think it's healthy to expect from time to time, even the most godly person is going to let you down. Is going to do something that kind of baffles you, that makes you think, oh, that's not like them. That's weird. That's just part of life. But it's also important to remember that, and this is, I think, what's easier to forget, is that you too are imperfect. And sometimes you contribute to the hurt and the disappointment that others experience in this place. You know, I just caused some pain in somebody's life this week because of poor communication that was all my fault. I didn't intend to. I never set out thinking, you know what, I'm going to say this, and I really want to hurt this person. Nobody does that, right? I mean, I hope. But it happens. And so this week I had the opportunity that I don't particularly cherish, but I had the opportunity to say that I'm sorry. And to grow in humility. That's not fun. But I know that I need it. And you know, some of you no doubt are thinking, wait, what? Not me. I'm not the problem. These other people are the problem. I'm not contributing to the hurts in the community. Yes, you are. You do. It happens from time to time. We all do. And I think we need to acknowledge that and be able to say, yeah, sometimes I'm the problem. Sometimes I'm the reason that church is hard for other people. Have you ever said that? Have you ever thought that? I mean, seriously, think about this. We all contribute to the hurts that can happen in community. It's just the truth. And I think that's why Paul spends some time here addressing some of those more common things that make church community difficult. Bitterness, rage, anger, harsh words, slander. He says, get rid of it. It makes life hard for everybody. But Paul presents an alternative to all of these things that make relationships and communities so hard. Instead of running away, instead of responding with rage or anger or bitterness or harsh words or slander, instead, forgive one another as Christ forgave you. If there's one thing that the church community will teach you in the long term, it's how to forgive and how to ask forgiveness. To recognize that we both need other people to forgive us for our wrongs, and we will need to be generous with our forgiveness as others wrong us. And if I'm reading Jesus correctly in the Gospels, it seems like we're to forgive an infinite number of times. The church community presents us with this unique opportunity to be formed in the way of Jesus, to be able to model what he did. To forgive us, or to forgive at great cost to himself. I mean, that's what happens in forgiveness, right? It costs us something. It's us paying the price for what someone else did. That's Jesus. Just as you run hills to increase your endurance in running, you plant yourself in community, even in the hard times, to increase your ability to forgive and to love one another, to grow in Christ-likeness. James wrote an interesting thing that I think relates to this. In James 1, he says, "Dear brothers and sisters, when troubles of any kind come your way, consider it an opportunity for great joy." I'll just confess that's not the normal way that I think about things. But he continues, "For you know that when your faith is tested, your endurance has a chance to grow. So let it grow, for when your endurance is fully developed, you will be perfect and complete, needing nothing." And when I read that, I can't imagine that James was intending this for only situations outside of the church community. I've got to imagine when James wrote, "Dear brothers and sisters, when troubles of any kind come your way, consider it an opportunity for great joy." I think that very much applies to what we experience in here as well. And so maybe our thinking needs to change a bit when we're hurt by someone. Maybe instead of thinking, "Man, screw this church. What a bunch of jerks." Maybe we can look at slights and disappointments and disagreements as opportunities to grow us up like Jesus. To grow in love, patience, wisdom. Maybe we can even get to the place where we thank God for the growth that happens through conflict. You know, it's funny, if somebody irritates us on Facebook, what can we do? We just hide their feed, right? Isn't that a great thing? I don't know how many of you this applies to, but I have hidden probably 80% of people that I call my friends on Facebook in my feed. Because it just causes me too much internal, it's just gross to read some of this stuff. So I ignore it, I hide it, I don't have to worry about it. I can pleasurably enjoy my Facebook feed without any kind of, I hide everybody that I don't agree with. Now, I know what you're thinking. Is that the mature thing to do? The answer is no. I recognize that. And I know probably many of you have hidden me because of my incessant postings about the Cubs this last couple of weeks. I'm going a bit nuts, and I understand that. I get that. Hide away. But what's interesting about that is you can't do that in the church community. When you annoy me, I can't just hide your presence. It'd be way easier if I could. There'd probably be nobody left after 10 minutes, but you can't do that in church community. Nobody gets to hand select the people that make up their church unless you're in a cult. But nobody gets to hand select. It's I'll take you. It's just not the same. And I think God designed it that way for a reason. I think that's probably part of the brilliance of the church community. Because it's our interactions with people who aren't like us, who don't think the same way, who have different political understandings, who love different sports teams, who have different backgrounds. It's those interactions that cause us to grow in our ability to forbear, to forgive, to empathize. It causes us to grow in patience and humility. Essentially, it's this odd community of sinners and misfits that God thought was the best context for us to grow into Christ's likeness. Isn't that crazy? Church is where we learn the humility to say, "I'm sorry." And where we learn the grace to forgive others. And I can promise you that you will miss out on the formation that God wants to do in you if you leave every time you get your toes stepped on. And your toes will get stepped on, I can promise you that. The question is, how will you respond? When that happens, how will you respond? As we come to the communion table today, I want to remind you of what Paul said. In this alternative in living together, of doing life together in community, be kind to each other, tender-hearted, forgiving one another, just as God through Christ has forgiven you. Imitate God, therefore, in everything you do, because you are his dear children. Live a life filled with love, following the example of Christ. He loved us and offered himself as a sacrifice for us, a pleasing aroma to God. And it's this communion table, it's what Christ has done that unites us. Despite our differences, our disagreements, our annoyances, our hurts, all of that is canceled out when we come to the communion table. That takes precedence over everything. And I want to invite you to come and receive what Christ offers. Remember his self-giving, self-sacrificing love, that even while we were still sinners, Christ died for us to reconcile us with God. Let's pray, and then please come and receive what Christ offers. Father, thank you for your incredible grace. Thank you for the lengths that you went to reconcile us with yourself. God, may our hearts and our minds be just moved by that in such a way that we extend that same grace and forgiveness to one another. Amen.
You shelter us, you carry us. Would you stand as we sing this last song? Just sing all I know is. All I know is. All I have is. All I know is you. All my hope is. And all my hope is, and all my trust. good, so good. And your love never runs out, your love never runs. And you're good, so good. And your love never runs out, your love never runs. Can you grab a seat?
Well, as we wrap up this morning, let me just ask, what do you think God's saying to you today?
I don't think this is what you intended, but I think I felt like I should go back to the church that I left before I came to Evergreen. I've really done all these things, so I'll be seeing you guys later.
I'm staying here.
Okay. Anybody else?
I also don't think this is what you intended, but
I did a really bad job today.
No, but it made me actually think, well, maybe there would be some usefulness in me spending some time thinking about how I am contributing to making church hard for other people. Because I think if I had spent some time, I could probably get pretty close to identifying accurately what some of those things might look like.
Yeah. Thanks. Yeah, thanks for sharing that.
You know, as part of my role with the Ecclesia Network, which is a network of churches that Evergreen is part of, I get a chance to spend a lot of time with leaders from other communities and hear about what's going on in their church. It's super easy to fall into the comparison game. And I think what I hear God saying to me today is that the community in which I have placed you is uniquely gifted for your formation. And if you were in this other church or this other place where things might be better on this metric or that metric, that may not happen. And so I hear God saying to me, love the community that you're in, and even the hard parts, because those are the parts that I have designed for your good and for your maturity, which I think is what you're saying.
Yeah.
So that was what you intended.
Yes.
Yes.
Nailed it. Yeah. Somebody over here was going to say something. Yeah, correct.
I think that the scripture, I think that we shared, I think hits me the most in terms of the focus is so much on unity, and I think the question that that hit me was what is my vision for what unity looks like really small. Like how can it grow? Like what does oneness mean, and how can what has God made it to be, and is that something we all have a clear vision of? I don't know, so far as I got.
Okay. Yeah, thanks. Yeah, Jason.
If you're comfortable and things are great, we've been through like 9 years of nothing's come up and make you uncomfortable or you're thinking about leaving, then you may not be much in the shape. I'm saying that to myself.
Yeah, no, that's an interesting thought. You didn't hear Jason was saying, if you've been around the community for a long time and there's never been any, stepping on toes or any kind of conflict, that maybe you're not engaging in the community at the level that you should be. That's an interesting perspective. There's a train coming, but BD.
Yeah, I'll try to speak over the train. I think the thing that stands out to me is both forgiving and offering forgiveness, because I feel like you
Yeah, I think you're right. There is a thing that we rarely talk about, though, the idea of forbearance that I've always been fascinated by, because it doesn't happen well, I mean, it probably happens more than I think, but, you know, there are some times when we just don't need to make a big deal out of things. The things that we can just forbear and say, I recognize that that was hurtful toward me, but I'm going to choose to let it go. I'm just going to bear the brunt of that, let it go and move on, and not let that get in between the two of us. That's a practice that I feel like, you know, could increase in the church community, of where I don't feel like I need to, I mean, sometimes I do need to talk to you about something you've done, but sometimes I don't. Sometimes I can let it go and not have to worry about it. But the idea of forbearance is big in Paul's writings as well, I think. Okay, well, I'm going to transition out of this because there's a train. And maybe in the meantime, as Kelly comes forward, the train will be gone. So I'm going to have her come up and do that. I'm basically going to make her deal with this. That's what I'll do. I do. Rob, Grant, you had your hand up. When the train, this is a poor time for this, but when the train is not doing that anymore, maybe you can say the last word or tell us your announcement.
Let me know when.
No, stop.
Don't be fooled. This idea of forgiveness and reconciliation. I know there's a lot of ways in our culture where we want to connect with people and identify and say, hey, we're this way. Debbie's out. I think that reconciliation and forgiveness and forbearance and all these things is one of the ways in which the church can most become social and most shine in areas where people are hungry for that in their lives. I mean, I feel like there's a lot of overlap between what people say, oh, you know, we're for that, we're for taking care of the church, we're for that. There's a lot of areas where there's, why would someone leave the church? Because you're getting that in other places, you know, that good thing. But I feel like forgiveness is really wrestling with letting go of grievances and staying connected to people that you're hurting and hurting you. There's an area where the church can really got people's draws and say, like, I don't see that anywhere and I want that. So I feel like that's a huge opportunity to love people around us by offering something that everyone really needs, whether they're present to that need or not.
Yeah, thank you, Rob. What Rob said basically was really the church is the only place in society that talks about forgiveness and where you can find ways to forgive others and forbear. We don't often find that in other places that we come into contact on a regular basis. The church is kind of one of the only places that does talk about that and demonstrates that and tries to live that out in communities and in society. So, thank you.
You're not turned on. Down.
I thought it was on better. Obviously, I can't see very well. So I hope you heard me again.
Because it was on.
Should we say it for a third time? I don't think so. So, thank you, Bob, for that teaser earlier about the new people's group. I see a lot of people on the edge of their seats, and I'm sure you're waiting to hear for the information about it. So it is tonight, that's right, tonight, at 5 p.m. at Bob and Amy Hyatt's house, which is in Southwest Portland, and the address is on this sheet right here. They're going to provide the mains, and we are all supposed to bring sides or desserts, right? Or drinks?
Or drinks.
And drinks, okay. So yes, please come if you're new or newish to Evergreen, even if you've been here for like a year and never been to one of these things, please come and hang out and get to know people, and it's a great way to get to know people on a smaller scale. So I encourage you to do that. A couple of other things, if you're interested in home communities, there's information on here. You can also talk to Dave Stewart and John Cogden about those. Another great way to get plugged into the community on a smaller scale and get to know people. Yeah, it's really awesome. Home communities are great. There's other things on here to look at. I'm not going to go through all of them. But yeah, there's lots going on in our community, things coming up at Christmas time and different things. So please check it out. So I will bless us now if you would all stand up. Evergreen, this week, may you seek humility when you have hurt others, and may you offer forgiveness when others have hurt you. So go in peace.
Speed of God.